sign that populations are increasing. So this is an impact on the ban of those pesticides and the work of conservation programmes and organisations. Natural England was established in 2006, manages England's green farming schemes. Reducing the decline of biodiversity is one of their aims. They are the organisation that actually licence the protected species, including the European otter. They are involved in designating the national parks and areas of outstanding beauty, and also managing the national nature reserves and notifying sites of specialist scientific interest. The Environment Agency, responsibilities of this organisation, again they're a public body, a regulation of the major industry, flood and coastal risk management, water quality and resources, waste regulation, climate change and conservation. They played a very significant role in the UK Biodiversity Action Plan, and they have carried out lots of project surveys on the European otter. So, National Environmental Organisation, there's actually been a big growth in the non-governmental conservation organisations, and in the UK, membership for these types of organisations has grown faster than anywhere else. The Wildlife Trust, for example, in 1963, 4,000 members, but in 2012 went up to 800,000. RSPB, again, 1963, 30,000 members, in 2012, over 1.1 million members. So just to show you the difference in how people are thinking about these organisations. So looking at the Wildlife Trusts, basically they fall under the umbrella of the Royal Society of Wildlife Trusts. There's 47 of them across the UK. They manage around 2,300 nature reserves and about 800 hectares of ground. Their aim is to promote the conservation and study of nature, educate the public on understanding and appreciating nature. They're involved in influencing the European Common Agricultural Policy and are still trying to influence that. But they also work very locally as well as European level with projects which to do with habitat management, which directly impact on the otter as well. The Otter Trust was founded in 1976. They had sanctuaries across the country, including Suffolk, Cornwall and Durham. Their aim was part of a breeding programme with looking to reintroduce the otters to certain areas. They were credited with saving the otter from extinction in the eastern counties of the UK. They closed to the public in 2006, basically because there's no longer a need for them, because the otter numbers were increasing. They were re-establishing themselves in the areas, aided by the work that they did. So they shut up to the public in 2006, so after 30 years. So some of the work involved by some of these organisations, repairing some of the fragmented landscape, introduction of signage, which you've got an example here in this image here, caution otters, the introduction of tunnels underneath roads, and also the introduction of habitat corridors, which are basically semi-natural habitat which connect different isolated areas together. This sort of thing, it basically reduces the risk of inbreeding by matching different populations up, increasing the genetic diversity, which also basically leads to a healthier species, and reducing the mortality rates on roads. The use of the tunnels here is not just a case of putting a tunnel underneath a road, it is very much a case of putting in the fencing as well to guide the otter to using the tunnel, to stop them, and also taking them away from the road areas as much as possible. So habitat management, protection and management basically of existing habitats. Again, organisations like the Wildlife Trust would be involved in this. This could be fencing off trees and shrubs from livestock, trees recommended to be coppiced and pollarded rather than removed, so looking after the existing habitat that otters could be using. On the other side of it, they could be enhancing new habitat for the otters, again planting trees and shrubs to create cover for lying up areas for the otter, and also the creation of artificial holts and there's lots of advice out there about from these specialist organisations about how to create ideal halts for otters, in particularly placing them in areas where they are going to be safe for long-term reintroduction, and things like placing the halt above the highest flood levels, so they don't risk being flooded. So looking not now the localised projects happening, but look at the whole European directive. This is designed Biodiversity 2020, designed to halt the decline of wildlife and its habitats. It's a landscape scale approach to conservation, so instead of just looking at the one particular species, it's looking at the whole landscape, the whole habitat. So it's creating better wildlife habitats, aiming to increase bigger and less fragmented areas for wildlife, restoring at least 50% of degraded ecosystems, and encouraging more people to get involved in conservation by supporting wildlife gardening and outdoor learning programmes, and also the introducing new designated local green spaces. So a very broad approach, but all aiming to basically halt the decline of wildlife. The Environmental Stewardship Scheme, again this is European scale. It's an agri-environmental scheme. It provides funding for farmers and landowners in England to deliver effective environmental management on their land to the benefit of the otter as one of the example species. So they are apply for funding. Funding obviously wouldn't be granted if certain practices weren't carried out properly. Examples of how this would impact on the European otter. Ploughing close to a breeding halt is not allowed. Removal of dense vegetation using methods that involve ground disturbance. Removal of materials like dead wood, etc. And coppicing and thinning of trees that may damage the habitat used to provide cover around a halt or natal den. So all these things are what are not specified that you're not allowed to do. So legislation. Originally, basically there's been domestic animal legislation in the UK from the very early 1900s, but it wasn't until you're looking at 1967 with the Protection of Wild Birds Animals Act, or 1954 sorry, it was updated in 67, was the first piece of legislation brought out to benefit a wild animal. It was eventually decided that there were more species that should have been included, so we saw the Protection of Wild Creatures and Wild Plants Act in 1975 was introduced, and then eventually all the acts were consolidated into the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1982, which is relevant to today. So the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981 basically is looking at the protection of animals. It is an offence to kill, injure or take any Schedule 5 animals, which includes the European otter. It is an offence to damage, destroy or destruct access to Schedule 5 animals shelter. There's also a Schedule 6, and again the specific conditions set aside for Schedule 6 animals, which again includes the European otter. It is an offence to use traps, snares or poisons where they might endanger this animal. If a casualty must only be kept for the purposes of tending to it until it is no longer disabled, and if no reasonable chance of recovery, the animal may be killed. So it's always looking if wildlife rehabilitation organisations, they cannot keep it for longer. As soon as the animal is well, then they need to release. We've also got the Wild Mammals Protection Act 1996. This makes it easy for police to get involved, whereas it's an offence to inflict cruelty on any wild animal with intent. The maximum penalty £5,000 and 6 months imprisonment, and the only exception for this is basically for mercy killings. Okay, so legislation related to the use of pesticides. There's quite a bit out there. Food and Environment Protection Act 1985, it regulates the use of pesticides, particularly those that threaten the health of humans, animals and plants. Following the introduction of this legislation, the Advisory Committee on Pesticides was also established, and it's their role to produce codes of practice that people must abide by. And the Agricultural Act 1986 This also includes specific legislation or guidelines for the use of pesticides in environmentally sensitive areas. The IUCN Red List of Threatened Species is a global scientific approach to providing information on the status, trends and threats to a species. This is the organisation involved in the classification of the European otter, which is currently classified as near threatened. Now, originally, when they realised that the otter was in such a large decline, the otter was classified as vulnerable in the 1970s. So due to the numbers increases, it's still a protected species, but it is showing as a result that numbers are re-establishing themselves. So summary, otters' numbers have increased. There has been cases, more and more evidence of diurnal activity where otters don't mind being watched by people, although they are a very secretive animal. They are just getting more habituated to humans now. So numbers are increasing, like we said in the original table, up to 59% of potential sites are active now, which is great. And this is really resulting from the legal protection under the Wildlife and Animals Act, and also the ban on those pesticides which were having such a massive impact on them. Is obviously what we are aiming towards is ecological carrying capacity, which basically the natural limit of the population in a particular environment. We're not at that yet, obviously, because of, like we said, only 59% of potential sites are active. So it still sees for the continuing conservation efforts of those local organisations like the Wildlife Trust, and also for the European levels with the directives which have an impact on farming. So it would be nice to see that the otter will continue to make a comeback. That's the end. Thank you very much.